Hey there, friends. I hope that you enjoy this episode of the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast as much as I enjoyed making it. I want to take a moment here at the beginning to extend a special offer, an invitation to you, our dear listeners, to join the Remembering course. Our next start date is going to be in middle of March. This is a powerful, deeply moving, and for many people, transformational experience into the heart of colonization, climate change, family histories, ancestors, and so many other critical intersecting pieces. Just visit our website, Sequoia Samanvaya. All the information is in the link below.
Hello, and welcome to the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast. My name is Sara Jolena Wolcott, and I am your hostess on this sacred learning journey of unraveling, unveiling, and becoming more fully alive at the end of the world as we know it. In this podcast, we offer up to you, dear listener, 3 forms of episodes to support your journey of remembering and reenchanting. First, conversations with amazing people. Second, storytelling. And third, myth casting. In this episode, we're going to bring you a conversation between myself and another amazing, fascinating leader in the areas of remembering and reenchanting.
Hello, and welcome to the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast. I am so delighted today to be joined by Dr. Lyla June Johnston, who is an Indigenous musician, scholar, and community organizer of Navajo, Dene, Cheyenne, and European lineages. She focuses on Indigenous rights, supporting youth, traditional land stewardship practices, and healing intergenerational and intercultural trauma. I've known Lyla June for several years now, and when I learned that she was completing her doctoral research from the University of Alaska on the ways in which pre-colonial Indigenous nations shaped large regions of Turtle Islands, also known as the Americas, to produce abundant food systems for humans and non-humans, I immediately knew that this was a story that I wanted to bring to our listeners of this podcast. So I just actually want to start off by taking a moment to appreciate and thank you, Lyla June, for the decades of work, poetry, music, and your own spiritual journey that's brought you to this place, and it has inspired so many people, some of whom are going to be listening with us today. And also to bring appreciation to your teachers, your elders, and your spiritual guides. And of course, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
So there's so much that we can talk about, but I really want to focus on the incredible work that you've been bringing to light in your dissertation. Your research compiles case studies from across the Americas about the Indigenous food systems and several in-depth interviews with contemporary elders. Your case studies vary from Zuni floodwater farming, soil diversity and health in the Southeast, and soil management in the prairie ecosystems, aquaculture systems that led to clam gardens in the Pacific Northwest, and aquatic farm gardens in Bolivia, oyster fisheries in the Chesapeake Bay, and Chumash fisheries in South Carolina, just to name a few. And part of what I love about what you've done in this dissertation is how much is challenging a lot of the conventional attitudes and wisdom in the environmental movement, even though in a lot of ways you're pointing to what's already been in plain sight. So your research clearly points to the more than 3,000 years of Indigenous food systems and their related economies and cultural systems. And transforms humans into a keystone species that support the flourishing of other species, and as you say, are architects of abundance, which is such a beautiful phrase. And I'm kind of curious, like if you could start us off by sharing some examples or just some places where you really saw and that really have stood out to you over time of these architects of abundance.
Yes. And I'm not sure why, but the thing that always comes to my mind first is the chestnut groves of the East. I don't know why. I think maybe I'm mildly obsessed with chestnut trees. But what I really like about the research around chestnuts is that we have a lot of fossilized pollen evidence. And I really love fossilized pollen research. Some call it palynology. And so what I like about it is a lot of, as you know, a lot of our oral histories, a lot of our bodies were destroyed during the first century of contact, wherever people were contacted. They estimate that about 98% of Native people died. So a lot of the records that we had, including our infrastructure, which was always biodegradable, right? Like it didn't usually leave a footprint longer than 50 years, 60 years. So a lot of our cities are not even detectable because we designed them purposefully to go back to the earth. And so anyways, but what did remain is the fossilized pollen record, right? Like that's something no one can argue with. And what we find is chestnut pollen arriving in places out of nowhere around 3,000 years ago, specifically one site in Kentucky, what we now call Kentucky. And you see 3,000 years ago, chestnut pollen just appears out of nowhere and is sustained for 3,000 years straight until about 1830, when the chestnut blight wiped out all the chestnuts in the East, which also wiped out about 98% of the chestnuts. So we see this parallel extinction happening between indigenous peoples and the species and the food systems that they augmented over time. So I just think it's amazing. And you also see hickory nut and black walnut kind of in the mix of that all of the sudden. This is a study by Delcourt et al. It's, I believe it's called a prehistoric fire in the Appalachian chestnut groves or something to that extent. And what they're talking about is they also find fossilized charcoal appear at the same time, indicating that people manage these chestnut forests with fire, with routine controlled burns. And so that story alone, right? It says so much. It says that Native people could sustain food systems for 3,000 years, right? Which is kind of amazing in and of itself. Mm-hmm. That's 1,000 years older than Jesus. Like, these are old things. It also points to how long we've been here. We've actually been here much, much longer than that. They just found 23,000-year-old footprints in New Mexico, human footprints. It also points to the fact that we were very intentional with our land management processes. We weren't passive hunter-gatherers, right? We were gardeners of huge agroforestry systems. That flies in the face of what most Americans not only believe, but kind of want to believe, is that, oh, Native people didn't do anything here. They were just running around looking for a berry to eat that was naturally growing somewhere, or hunting a deer that was naturally walking around. But they don't understand that by burning under the understory of these chestnut groves, we were augmenting grasslands that would attract the deer. So we had our deer and our chestnut. You also see fossilized sumpweed and goosefoot and sunflower pollen in that same pond where they took out the soil core. Yeah, you take out a soil core and you can analyze that one. That one had 10,000 years worth of information in it. So it's all those edible plant species were in this place along with your deer. So it also points to the intentionality of indigenous food systems, which I wish we didn't have to prove. I wish we didn't have to say, yeah, we were smart enough to intentionally have foresight and gardening. But sadly, that is where America is at. They think we were cavemen who didn't have any ability to create. And the last thing I'll say about this case study is, it shows how old we were. It shows how intentional we were. And it also shows how deep of a relationship we had with certain species, how the chestnut was like our child, and we were the children of the chestnut as well. We had a give and take relationship, and of course that fed everything around us as well. So I mean, there's a lot to be said, but I love that specific case study because it just shares and reveals so much, including how it fell apart. You could see in the fossil record very clearly the chestnut disappears. And how sad is that this thing used to grow from Maine to Georgia, and now it's the American chestnut is nearly completely extinct. They've been replaced mostly with Asian chestnuts.
Mm-hmm. And it's, as you're telling a story about the chestnut, some of the readings that I've done in terms of early Europeans when they were first coming to this continent, and they would write in such beautiful prose back to Europe about the chestnut in particular, was one of the trees and one of the nuts, and talked about how they could just, walk amongst these fields of chestnuts that would be as high as their waist, and the level of abundance that they experienced when they first came. And how that didn't last long, how that this was really maybe a century or so before the chestnuts started dying, and the tremendous sadness that ensued from that. So yeah, it feels like a really poignant and powerful tree to be honoring to begin the conversation.
Yeah, and it shows how we, as a species, because I firmly believe that whatever Native people did, any of us can do if we're guided by the right value system. And so it just shows okay, if Homo sapiens took care of any food system, whether it's chestnut or whatever, for 3,000 years, then we can do the same. Obviously, we're not doing it right now. Our food system's about to collapse due to short-sightedness and, the things we've all heard over and over, greed and short-sightedness. But now it's coming to a head of oh, we think that we are doomed as a species. We think that we're just naturally going to screw ourselves over, and that's just quote unquote the way it is. And I think this evidence shows no, that's not how it has to be. If these people were capable of doing this, we can do it as well, but we need to be guided by the proper value system. And that is what I'm hoping this dissertation helps people see, is you have a lot to learn from Indigenous peoples. Let us take the lead for a while. Let us show you how to do it.
Right, because you don't really learn value systems simply by repeating a set of values, orally.
Yeah, you can. You can. That's a start. But of course, it's a practice as well. It's an embodied system for sure.
Can you speak some about what are the value systems, or the values and the principles that you found throughout multiple Indigenous communities in Turtle Island?
Right. Well, I identified maybe 6 main ones, and there is no such thing as an Indigenous monolith. A lot of people are very adamant about that, and they should be. There's no such thing as oh, all Indigenous peoples are this way or that way. However, it was extremely striking how similar some of their narratives were across the board, even into Australia and Bolivia and beyond. I think humans come to a certain a certain truth about reality, and it can be very common among them. And there's also room for diversity at the same time. But anyways, so one of the first ones that comes to mind is biological egalitarianism. Um, in other words, like all life is equal, which sounds like duh and cliche, but if it's so duh, then why aren't we acting like that? Like, if it's so obvious, like, why is our entire system set up to benefit humans? It's kind of like the same critique of white supremacy, but human supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
It's like we're more important. We're above you. You are our slave. You know, this earth is our slave to do what we want you to do because we're smarter and stronger, and we have the power to manipulate you for our own benefit. But these other systems are guided by extreme biological egalitarianism, equality. You know, that's the easiest English word to say, is like these systems are designed to benefit everyone. So, for instance, the clam gardens, right? They created these intertidal rock walls, 6,000-year-old food system, right, in Pacific Northwest. And they can actually hold back sediment and water to make these calmer, warmer pools. And they augmented clam habitat. One big island, Quadra Island, they found 35% of the coastline had this clam gardens. And this is a huge island. This is like a small country, you know, like, so 6,000 years ago, people are moving immense amounts of rock to create more clam habitat. And if you listen to the interviews with the elders, they say the clam is their own nation. They have their own nationhood status. And so who among us could see a clam as equal? And as it's relating to it on a nation to nation basis? And who among us could interact with the clam with that level of diplomacy and relationality and respect? Like, that's what these people did for 6,000 years. And so there's no like, oh, you're just a bivalve, you know? Or like, you're just a mollusk. Like everything, to the smallest fly, you know, to the largest moose, has a place and a right to be here. So like, that is a huge value that drives these systems. The same could be said for the eel farms in Australia, where they would build these really elaborate rock causeways and canals that they would funnel the eel as it swam from the sea to the freshwater headwaters back and forth, and sort of support its migration and make sure it's clean, make sure it's healthy. 6,000-year-old system that these people have been farming eel for 6,000 years. And again, if you listen to the elders in the literature, they say the eel is our relative. They have immense respect for the eel. And they don't say, oh, I have a bigger brain and I can speak a language, I'm better. They say this eel has equal worth, equal right to me. And not only that, but it gives of its own flesh to feed my children. So what can I give to it to make sure that it perpetuates, that its families are happy, that its families continue? And whatever they did, it worked, because those eels were going and came back recently after restoring the system, which had been turned into a cattle farm. They restored it. And so that egalitarianism between all life is so much the foundation, I feel, of these food systems. compare that to a factory farm, where there's just thousands and thousands of living beings, bodies, people. Like, to us, the pig is a person too. These are people, living in their own poo, their children, just terrible enslavement of life. I'm not saying I'm guilty too. I have bacon every now and then that I probably shouldn't be eating, but I'm also caught in a system. As a human being, we are born into this system that it's like, eat this crap or find a way to figure out how to farm. And it's like, a lot of us were never given farming skills, so we're having to relearn them right now, right? So anyways, the value system, as you can see, is very different. There's no hierarchy. And I could go on. That's only one, but I'll pause there in case you wanted to share anything.
You're speaking to like this egalitarianism within the context of a kin-centric worldview, and the sense of kinship is really is part of that. It's part of the egalitarianism that, as you're talking about the relatives there, and I love the stories of these the duration and the sense of kinship, and I hear them also in your interviews with the elders that are beautifully written up, and just like anyone can read them. Like, they always kind of share those values through their cosmovision and through their creation stories. And when I think about what it might mean to shift into a more kin-centric, practical worldview, in terms of like lived out actions and transformations of landscapes and waterscapes, to reflect a more kin-centric world, I'm always curious, what do we, it seems that we might need to tell foundationally different stories, about our place in the cosmology and our place in that system. Because the myths are so critical for how people think about, who they are in relationship to others.
They are. And speaking of myth, like, even the word Europe is not an ancient word. It's a new word, and it comes from Europa, who is a mythological character who was stolen by Zeus and raped, And so rape of women and land is encoded into the word Europe, which is kind of sad. But if you look deep, I say it's young. People say, oh, it's a Greek myth, it's ancient. No, not really. I went to a cave in France recently where there was cave paintings of ibex, which are these beautiful, like, goat creatures with huge horns, buffalo, and horse. And these cave paintings in France were 17,000 years old. So I want to know what those people called the land. You know what I'm saying? Like, I want to know the value system that drives a human to walk a mile into a cave with a torch and write love letters to bison on the walls of the caves. Like, I want to know what those people were calling the land. And these were beautiful drawings. These were not like stick figures. These were gorgeous. I mean, phenomenal paintings of buffalo and horses. And then there's also the 40,000-year-old Venus figurine that was found in German soil, that, people had been shaping the land into the form of a woman in what we now call Germany 40,000 years ago. I want to know what those people called the land. You know what I'm saying? Like, this Greco-Roman BS is really young, actually. It's a lost thing, and we're being led by a lost thing. So no wonder we are lost as well right now. So yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. It's like those creation stories and what some call myth, but what Native people call, like narrative, important narrative,
Mm-hmm.
and value systems. They really do encode so many, they normalize things for better or worse, whatever we choose to normalize. And that then creates the world around us.
Thank you so much for sharing that story. I'm actually, it's sweet. I'm working on a new course on looking at pre-Christian Europe. And I had forgotten some of those stories. So thank you for bringing them up again. Yeah, it's really
You're
sweet.
welcome. So some of the other values that you find in these systems, you touched on it, is relationality is one way to say it. Kinship is another way to say it. But this notion of like, it's really hard to translate into English, but like the best way to try to describe it is the feeling you feel when you see your grandmother. Like that, like warm, fuzzy family feeling. I mean, it depends on who your grandma is and what kind of relationship you have with her. Maybe you had an abusive grandma, but let's just say a family member that you love who isn't mean to you and you have a special connection with them, whether it's biological family or chosen family, like that feeling, that like kinship, that love, that familyhood, that feeling extended to trees, that feeling extended to bison, that feeling extended to the smallest bug. I'm actually watching a bug walk across the deck right now. Like, can you have the same love for that bug as you have for your grandma? That is what these systems have almost universally. You're not just equal to me, like you are my family. And, we hear that a lot. I think that was even shared in the old Disney Pocahontas film, like as historically inaccurate as it is and how problematic as that is. There was one thing they touched on, which is like the heron is my brother, and even though that's a cliche, somewhat cheesy Disney movie, like that is actually a really strong reality. Like the Heltsa people of the Pacific Northwest, I'm saying their name slightly wrong. It's a new language for me, but they start their whole new year when the herring come. So when the herring come in the February time frame, they start the whole new year. And so that's how much love and appreciation they have for the fish, much different than like, oh, I caught me a marlin. Look at my marlin. I'm going to take a picture of it. Ha ha. This is elevating my ego. I'm a good fisherman, like check me out, instead of like, would you do that to your grandmother? Would you hang her dead body on a metal wire and take a picture of yourself beside it with your thumb up? Like, yeah, like, no, that would be obscene, And so instead, you take the body and you give thanks. You give an offering. You say, wow, like you just gave your body to me so that my family could live. Like, wow, that is huge. That's a huge gift that the world gives us every day and gives to other creatures as well. Like, it's huge. It's an honor. And so we honor it in return. So yeah, that relationality piece. There's also the reverence. There's a lot of R words: relationality, reverence, respect, reciprocity, responsibility. Those were sort of the core value systems. I couldn't find an R word for biological egalitarianism, but if you figure out one, let me know. But yeah. So yeah, there's a reciprocity, of course, is like, okay, these animals are feeding me, these plants are feeding me, let me make sure to feed them. So what you find is a lot of these food systems are designed to feed other things. For example, the clam gardens, where the birds would feast on the clams, the otters, the minks, etc. even the Heiltsuk folks who do the kelp gardens, the kelp forest planting, they maintain kelp forests because they know if they can uphold the kelp forest, they can uphold the herring, which can uphold the whole food web. So they're constantly working to build up the base, not only for their own benefit, but for the benefit of the entire coastal ecosystem. So that's that reciprocity piece of yeah, let's give to this system. Very different, right, than an extractive system that's like, I really don't care about giving back to these cows. I need to milk them for everything they've got, and I really don't care what their living conditions are. And I really don't care if they get to have a real family or a real life or children. I don't care. I care about me, myself, and I. Reverence is a hard one to translate, right? Like, how do you translate sacredness into this world? Like, maybe the grandmother is another way to do that. Like, your grandmother is precious. She's sacred, like, she's so sacred that when you touch her, you should touch her with the utmost gentleness and the utmost care. So similarly, we would touch the earth. You might say like a little girl is sacred. Like maybe that's something we can wrap our heads around. Like you see a little girl, like she's so precious, she's so innocent, she's so gentle. Like if you ever say anything around her or touch her, it should be with the utmost respect, teaching her consent. Like you would be very careful, right? So how do you have that same level of care with a clam garden, with a bison herd, with a plains, with a river system? Like if you touch it with the utmost love and care and gentleness. Okay, responsibility. This is a one that we find a lot, is like Native people almost across the board, I swear to God. They say, Creator put us here on this, not just this planet, but this specific bioregion. Creator put us here so that we could protect this land and steward this land. So what I find across the map is this responsibility to homeland, like this divine assignment to homeland. Like, okay, you humans, you're assigned to this place, and there's a covenant between them. So that's the responsibility piece. So imagine if our society was guided by reverence, reciprocity, respect, relationality, reciprocity, and biological egalitarianism, right? Like everything would change, everything. And that is what we're being called to do today.
It feels so good when you say that, like that call, and that reminder that's, so firmly based on thousands and thousands of years of human actions. It feels so hopeful and so joyful as an opportunity that we know we can get to, because as humans, we've done it before, even though this society has no clue what that might mean or how, where to go. But knowing that humans have been there before and knowing that there are still Indigenous elders and that knowledge is being actively remembered that can take us there again it's just like, it just fills me with like this tremendous joy.
Thank you for that reflection. I am always curious, like how this stuff lands with people. I'm also surprised you read the dissertation. like, I'm like, I don't know if anyone's gonna read this. I gave a TED talk that was, in a format that's more accessible, or I'm not a big reader myself, actually. I had to read, obviously, to write the dissertation.
Yeah.
But I have trouble like sitting down and digest. So thank you for reading it. Do you think other people would read it, or do you think it's in a format that's a little boring or technical for the world to be interested in?
We're living in a society where less people read. I mean, there's definitely going to be a link to your TEDx talk on, in the show notes. And I think it's, you have a lot of different audio that you're putting out there around these topics, which I think is awesome. This is a really readable dissertation. And I was actually, one of the things I wanted to talk with you about is actually like the way in which you're doing this very challenging thing that's really important. And that I think a lot of us are trying to do, which is both to integrate any kind of spiritual process into the research process, is like we're still learning how to do that in a way that academia can handle. But in particular, you're really actively trying to bridge multiple worlds in this dissertation. You're bridging the academic world, Indigenous ways of knowing and thinking and describing, which is not the same as, Western academic concepts. And also you make suggestions for policymakers and people in the federal government and who are working in, the park systems and other policy spaces, both here in America and Turtle Island and overseas as well. And, those are not easy. And also just like kind of quote unquote regular citizens who are engaged in other ways. And those are not easy like audiences to bridge regardless. And I think you do a really good job of it. I think it's very readable. I would love to see a variation of it in a book format, but I'm kind of partial to book formats myself. And I hope if the opportunity arises that you kind of, do or find a cool way of bringing it into multiple formats. And I'm sure you're going to do that in lots of different ways, but I think it's very readable. And I was actually I was curious if you've had anyone in the policy world who's kind of reached out to you, or who you've had any kind of engagement yet from that space.
I'm happy to report that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Office in Washington, D.C. area had me give a presentation to their workforce.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, I think I forget the number of people in the Zoom call, but there was hundreds. I remember there was hundreds. So that's great, right? Like,
that is great.
And it's actually part of a series that they have called something broadcast. I wish I remember the name, but the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is following Biden's memorandum, which said, we have to integrate Indigenous knowledge into all of our federal agencies. So because he said that, you have all these people who are now giving presentations. So my presentation was awesome. It was fun. And it was one of like dozens that they're doing of Native folks coming in and teaching the federal government how to act right,
kind of amazing.
So it's been really cool. It's an interesting time right now, but other than that, not a whole lot of like nitty gritty policy stuff from me specifically, consulting folks yet, although I just finished the dissertation like half a year ago, so it might be picking up, and I'm kind of getting back on my feet after finishing the dissertation. And I got a little farm in my homeland, which has taken a lot of energy to get it up and running, so I'm finally like coming out of my cave and back into the world a little bit to do this type of work. But yeah, I think the world, if it ever was ready for Native people to act, to influence policy on state, federal levels in a very meaningful, significant way, I think it would be right now. And absolutely. That's not to discount the work my elders and ancestors have been doing all along. Like, we've been shaping policy, believe it or not, for a long time, but in a way that's open and outward and intentional and sweeping, in a top-down kind of way. I think this would be the time. The first ever co-management between the National Park Service and an Indigenous tribe just kicked off in the Joshua Tree National Park, with the 29 Palms band of Mission Indians. So it's an exciting time, and I think every bit of our hard work over the past 500 years of trying to interact with this colonial society, is starting to pay off.
Mm-hmm. And so let me just actually make sure I'm being clear in like some of what you're offering. You offer Indigenous regenerative ecosystem design, IRED. And I'm actually just going to quote something that you wrote in the dissertation. It speaks directly to the colonial canon that both consciously and unconsciously misrepresented Indigenous peoples for centuries. Terms offered by previous scholars come from studies with Indigenous communities, but they do not explicitly name them as Indigenous systems. This word helps to signify that this research is specially regarding Indigenous people and their land management techniques. Regenerative is used to help the world understand that these practices resulted in positive effects for surrounding ecosystems. These systems did not simply break even, as the term sustainable suggests, but rather left places healthier and more biodiverse than they found them. They augmented and renewed living systems through regenerative management techniques such as selective harvest, nutrient cycling activities, species facilitation, habitat expansion, and genetic diversification. Because these practices are generally guided by kin-centric ethic versus an anthropocentric ethic, they by definition work to improve the whole system, which is very far from where most of our policies are today, agricultural, fisheries, etc. And so, it's a very bold framework. And at the same time, I think like you do manage to shape the framework in a way that I think that policymakers can at least begin to engage with, which is quite, it's stepping stones towards larger cultural shifts and really important ones. And I'm really glad to hear that there has been some uptake, and I will certainly be encouraging others. I think that like part of this is also like it's food systems, and food systems also mean economic systems for anyone listening who's actively engaging in trying to create new economic systems. This is part of what we're talking about. And it's often missing, these kinds of actually relying upon Indigenous regenerative ecosystem design is something that hasn't made it into a lot of the larger white-led, usually, I probably shouldn't say that either, but colonial-minded led conversations.
I think it's fine.
Most of these conversations are led by white men around trying to create quote-unquote new economies are not relying upon the systems that have like actually worked in this biosphere and in these collective biospheres for generations. Just to help make some connecting the dots points here. Part of what you're, it's a consistent recommendation that you're making, which, sounds like completely makes so much sense, is the importance of various kinds. And you're making this for policymakers, you're making this for citizens, you're suggesting this for people who are involved in financial and moving monetary flows, is the importance of actual return of land and giving leadership, financial power, and various forms of management control to Indigenous communities who still carry these knowledge practices. And that's, again, it's something that's often not talked about as part of, in ecological solutions. I'm just wondering if you can say more about like this. I think it's obvious, but if you say more about the incredible importance of land return to enabling these regenerative systems to redevelop again.
Well, only in America would it be necessary to explain why we should return land to Native people. And let me explain what I mean by that. Let's say there's 400,000 Dene people enrolled, right? So let's say the entire Navajo Nation went to Italy and we murdered all the 98% of all the Italians that exist today. And the art of pizza and the culture and the painting and all of the rich cultural things going on in Italy were like endangered and on the verge of extinction. And even the Italian language was only spoken by a few thousand people. And meanwhile, the Navajo Nation was sitting in Medici's castle just with their feet up, like having a ball. Obviously, we would say, what the hell are you doing? Give this land back to the Italians. You just murdered everyone. And their language is almost extinct. You better help them get their language back too. Help them get back on their feet. Like, it's insane that we have to explain why our land should be given back. Like, you murdered us and you took of course, Americans would say, we didn't murder you. We were at war with you and we won and you were weak. So sorry, maybe you should have fought harder. That's what a lot of white men will say. It's not just to us, but to themselves to ease their, guilt and whatever. But the reality is we didn't want to fight. We never wanted to fight. We didn't want to fight Europe. We came to the shoreline with baskets of food. We wanted to be friends. I'm not saying all tribes are perfect or peaceful. We had our wayward brethren here and there, but by and large, we were trying to be relatives. So that's number one. It's not just about giving land back to increase biodiversity and support the soil health and create lasting food systems and protect species from extinction and clean up the water and blah, blah, blah. Like all of that is true. Like land back will result in all of those things because the stewards will be back in charge and they'll be stewarding it according to their value systems. But more blaringly obvious than that to me is like you should give it back because you stole it. Not all of it, right? Like we don't have to displace, Frank and Jane and all the people who are here, and their families. We would never do that same thing that people did to us, even though some would say we should deserve to, but we don't. Most of us don't see it that way. It's more like give back the parts that are not being utilized, like the national forests, like the land trusts that were seized by the freaking Spanish crown. Give me a break. That is not a legitimate land holding. You stole that. There's so many huge swaths of land that simply should not be supervised by European descendants. There's just no reason. That's exactly the same as Navajo Nation murdering everyone in Italy, taking over the entire land, and then saying, well, we're not giving it back. We won. We won it fair and square. It's not like it's just the right thing to do. So when you restore lands to Indigenous peoples, it's not just about the ecological benefits, although that's definitely part of it. It's about restoring not just the soil, but the soul of this multicultural world we've found ourselves in. Restoring our soul, restoring our dignity, restoring our respect, making amends, making relationships. But we also live in a world where, as much as I say this till I'm blue in the face, people don't care, So what I have to do then is I have to say, okay, well, let's look at the benefits that you'll get out of this. You'll get a benefit of your planet won't die. You'll have food for your kids. You'll have water to drink. And together we can create something that we'll be proud of. And I think those will mitigate against climate change. We'll become more resilient, on and on and on. So sadly, a lot of what I'm having to do now is not say, hey, give this land back because it's the right thing to do. I'm having to say, hey, give this land back because it's going to benefit you, you know. Sadly, like that's kind of where we're at. Um, and if that's what I have to do for now, then that's what I'll do. Because it will benefit everyone. Um, let me give an example just to make it less abstract. A report recently came out that Indigenous peoples, as defined by this report, people who lived in the same homeland for thousands of years and still there, um, comprise about 5% of the world's population, as defined by this report, and protect 80% of the world's global biodiversity. So 5% of the world's people protecting 80% of the biodiversity. So that's a very clear way of proving like, no, really, like if you support Indigenous peoples, you will actually save the planet. Like this is just how it is. And when I was in Florida, right, you go to Hollywood, Florida, West Palm Beach, all that stuff. It's looking a little dead, you know. As soon as you get into Big Cypress reservation, you just see flamingos flying around everywhere. You see all kinds of water birds. You see different types of trees, different types of grasses. All of a sudden, the ecosystem shifts. And people are like, oh, those, you know, Indians, they just live out in the boonies. But they're taking care of those boonies. And like those boonies are thriving, you know. Those boonies have more flamingos there than anywhere else in Florida because they have made a home for them and they're not scared of them. They want them to be there. So that's just one example. Yeah, but I think you're right. I think ultimately land back is a way to not only heal the soil, but to heal the soul of our country.
You know, when you say that, I feel like the importance of healing, of how healing goes back in time and also takes place right now and supports the future. That some of this work is, and some of what you're speaking to is like, you know, changing the way we understand the history and telling very different historical stories than what people generally speak to. And recognizing the need for healing and the need for that deeper soul healing. And the return of land that is part of that healing process.
Yeah, absolutely.
With that healing of the soul and that past and future and present, the swirl of time, comes so much joy. That there's great sadnesses, you know, in what you're in the loss of how much has been lost, but the deep joy is also very, very much present.
Yes. Yeah. And you're right. I think I always wondered what they meant by saying when you heal 7 generations backward and 7 generations forward. And I was like, oh, that's cool. I have no idea what you're talking about, but that sounds cool. I understood the forward part, right? Because when we heal today, our descendants are going to be healthier because they won't have as bent out of shape parents, you know, because we've done the work to heal a little bit. But the backward part, I didn't understand. Like, how do we heal our ancestors? And I think I realized part of what they mean, you know, is like, it's almost like you redeem things that happened in the past. You make a story that was painful and give it an ending that is beautiful, you know, and that heals them, you know, whether you're a native person whose ancestors were in concentration camps, you know, all the crazy stuff native people went through here, death marches, you know, massacres, blah, 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 just on, boarding schools, just insanity, right? And your ancestors went through that much pain, but then 2023 they see their great granddaughter thriving, you know. It redeems all that pain, you know. Or if you're European. I'm also half European. So you're European and your ancestors slayed people, that were innocent, and your ancestors enslaved people who were innocent. But today you're enacting peace building, reparations, reconciliations, you're working to be a part of the solution. Then those ancestors who made those mistakes can finally rest in peace, right? Like, oh, I did all this terrible stuff, but at least it resulted in something beautiful. And at least my great, 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 great granddaughter made it right for me. I think there's something beautiful about that too. And I think as a half white woman, that's also a part of my work. I have to, it's weird being half white, half native, I have like two different jobs to do. But I do, as a white woman, I have a job to do. I have reparations to give. And I often say, like, my white side is in constant state of like reparations to my native side. And like, I'm really good at English. I'm really good at writing. I'm really good at some of the things this white world can listen to. So let me put those skills at the service of the Indigenous message, So yeah, I think you're right. There's that swirl and there's that healing back and forth.
One of my teachers talks about privilege or good co-conspiratory actions as using one's privilege to shift power. And I hear that both in what you're recommending for people and also I hear a little bit of that in your internal dialogues and the ways in which the whole self can act towards shifting power. I don't know. Does that resonate at all?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's exciting it's not a burden. Like, oh, why are they asking for reparations? It's like, oh, they're just complaining again. It's not a burden. It's like, oh, wow. It's a canvas to paint on. Like, it's like these hundreds of millions of quote unquote Americans. And like, we have so much power to write the most beautiful story with our lives and our bodies. Like, how cool is that? Like, we have an opportunity every moment to be honorable people that our descendants look back and say, dang, I come from some dope people, And I think as a Native woman on my mom's side and a little bit on my dad's side too, I have that luxury of looking back on my Native ancestors and being like, wow, what incredible beings these were. Like, so I know how that feels to be a descendant of that. And I assure you, it's worth giving to our descendants, no matter who we are. But yeah, like a lot of the work my Native ancestors did, the way that they carried themselves in the face of adversity, in the face of atrocity, gives me so much trust in the world. Like, I can go to Amsterdam and people will like respect me, not because of anything I did, like because of what my ancestors did. I could go to Africa. I could go to Indonesia. I've been to all these places and people are just like, whoa, sometimes they call me a red Indian. You're a red Indian. Like, they don't really know like how to say it. And they've only seen a few things in Hollywood and whatever, but that's because my ancestors carried themselves a certain way. Now, wherever I go, there's a level of respect. And so why don't we carry ourselves in a way that's like, whoa, like 100 years from now, 200 years from now, our kids can travel around the world and say, and people will say, whoa, you're American. Like, instead of what they say now is like, oh my God, you're American. Like it's kind of annoying how much Europe just looks down on us. I was in Geneva recently and I was at a dinner table and I should not have said I was American because It's just palpable how much they're like, oh, okay. They didn't even really like, but once I said I was Native American, they're like, oh, okay. Tell me more about that, So I believe that we are doing this now with our various movements. We are, even though we have a long way to go and a uphill climb, I think we are writing that story right now.
Mm.
We are confronting shadows inside of ourselves right now.
Mm-hmm.
And we are working to make peace within ourselves and between each other. And I think we're in the thick of it, so it doesn't seem very successful, but I do believe we're going to get there.
Mm. Mm. May it be so. So I want to as we kind of come towards the ending of this conversation, and I'm looking at my notes I was taking before we began speaking. I'm like, oh, there's so much here we didn't talk about, but that's okay. What we have shared has been really, really beautiful and rich and really important. I think exactly what needed to be shared today. I want to actually kind of share a few things that I saw as kind of really pivotal reframings that you're doing in the dissertation and also in kind of your wider speaking about these histories and these possibilities, because you're really kind of doing both simultaneously. You're actively sitting on that bridge between the what has been and what could be. So we already talked about, debunking humans as separate and as a disease, which is really, flies in the face of so much of the kind of what has become much of the contemporary environmental narrative. That there is a deep hope that you are leading with and that you continue throughout, and that we've spoke about in different ways in this conversation, and the importance of healing our history, restoring places to people who are aching to return. And the land, as one of my colleagues says, the land is aching to have the people return to it. The incredible joy that is part of the value system and part of the way of living. And joy is so deeply missing from so many of environmental conversations and so much of thinking about land management. That part of that, the respect, the reciprocity, the relationality, the equality is infused with a joy. The shift from seeing wilderness to living heirlooms and going away from the notion of wilderness as something that's separate from human beings. Redefining scale. Because the ecosystem management processes of most Indigenous communities that you're describing are actually happening at a much wider scale and a much broader understanding of the system, it makes a lot of the systems thinking that we have today, I think, look actually kind of like it has a way to go before it gets there. And particularly in the way that generosity as a linchpin that keeps the system going. And that's part of that reciprocity. And then redefining the potential of collapse. You speak to how a lot of the different Indigenous communities have a historical narrative of collapse, and it becomes an opportunity to do something different, to refine culture and ecosystem management. And that's again, to think about collapse as an opportunity for refinement is totally missing from contemporary apocalyptic narratives of collapse, which very rarely see the possibility of survival within them. And all the many principles that are being expressed through myth and song and dance. And that part of what we're talking about is the revitalization of this sort of deep cultural revitalization which is part of that soil and soul that you were speaking to earlier. And that in all of this, we can recognize Indigenous histories as architects of abundance. And it didn't come from nothing, that the abundance that has been here came from highly intentional and purposeful people enacting it. And that is something that we can continue to learn from and relearn from and engage in differently today ourselves. And there are possibilities of doing things differently. And that they are right here. Those possibilities aren't simply something to be imagined or visioned on a vision board. They come from this deep engagement with the people of this place. And all of those things that I just mentioned, all of them are not part of a lot of contemporary environmental, economic, political, and poetic conversations. And of course, you do so with such poetry and music in your writing and in your speaking. So that's a note of appreciation. And just like, yeah, like as I'm kind of curious, like as you hear me reflect that back to you, like, is there anything else you like to add to it, or any other kind of reflection you like to bring to that?
Well, first of all, thank you for, almost paraphrasing the whole dissertation, because that's helpful,
Mm-hmm.
to recap it and to recast it. And also thank you for holding space for this conversation. I think one of the things that you said that is actually not present in my dissertation is this centering of joy. I don't think I use the word joy in all 400 pages of the dissertation. And it strikes me when you say that. And maybe it's because as a woman who looks Native and grew up Native, hasn't been a lot of joy. I mean, there is and there isn't. It seems like a struggle and a battle for me. Not all Native women. I can't speak for all Native women, but I wake up every day like in battle. My languages are going extinct. Half of my people have diabetes. Homicide's the third leading cause of death for Native women. Blah, 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 blah. A third of my people don't have running water. Like I wake up every day in war. But I think what you're saying is essential, because even though I don't think about joy very much, and I'm like this hardcore warrior lady, I think you're right. I think joy absolutely must have been an integral part of these systems. And that's something I failed to identify and I failed to write, because when you're in relationship with all of creation, every day is a celebration.
Mm-hmm.
When you're in like symbiotic, flow and momentum with life, and you get to have your families and your families are healthy, you get to do ceremony and you get to come here to earth and do what you came here to do, to be human, like that, there must be so much joy in that. And one of the most important words in Denebazad is hojo, which means, people say it means beauty, but I've also heard elders say it means something like joy. And that proves to me that you're right, that this is an important facet. And so just thank you for naming that, and thank you for centering that, because it reminds me that that's a very crucial element that I'm not honoring, perhaps in describing these systems, and also even in my own life, because I'm too busy fighting everything. Fighting with love, of course, fighting with kindness, but still fighting. Still working to defeat Goliath every day,
I don't know if you hear it in your voice, but I think it's hard to hear our own voices the way other people hear it, but like when you're like in your TED talk and when you're talking about these systems, like you get so animated. And maybe also because I love your poetry around Husan. Like that was one of the first poems of yours that I ever heard you share. And I remember the first time I heard you share it, and it was just so like powerful for me. Like the way your voice, it's like there's a joy that comes in just the tone when you're describing and talking about what has been and what might be. And I think that's what I was hearing. Not that it was necessarily spelled out, and the focus on gratitude that you do talk a lot about the focus on gratitude, but like that, I hear something in your voice that is that carries, it carries it. It's an invitation, and it carries me, and I think it carries other people who are listening to you, of what's possible, like in this very, like, oh, this could be really, really good, even though this is really hard now. There's something here that's like, it's entirely worthwhile to engage and to keep going.
Yes. I appreciate you letting me know that despite my my constant battle mode, that I still manage to reflect joy outward.
And to also acknowledge the battle, right? To acknowledge like how much for you to even be able to get to the place where you could write this dissertation, the battle, not both you and many other Native women have been through, to put this forward in this clear way, and the sacrifices that are entailed in maintaining that battle on behalf of all of life.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, it is true. But it's a battle we knew we were taking on, and for some weird reason, our souls still decided to take it on.
To participate.
But with a lot of help, a lot of help from people like you and ancestors and the world. We not all of us make it. I have a lot of Native sisters who are not here anymore, but as a whole, we get through. We get our message out there.
The word that's actually standing out to me on my notes is the word fire. And so many, fire has been such a part of our native ecosystems here, and around the world. It's been a part of European traditional management systems as well. And sometimes there's still memory of that. And, our capacity to use fire and the purifying way in which fire can heal the land, and the ways in which we so deeply need to change our relationship with fire, and the ways in which the fire can help water and can help the resurgence of water. And you frame your dissertation through the elements, the fire, water, air, and earth. And I'm actually wondering if you have perhaps a poem or just a few words or a song or something that can kind of just help us acknowledge these elements, and the many ways in which we can heal our relationships with them.
Yeah, I'll read a poem to close. It's actually about water, though. But I think it's still fitting because it talks about healing the inner landscape. And as much as I wrote this dissertation to help us heal the outer landscape, it must happen in tandem with healing the inner, everything we've been through. So I'll close with this poem. Thank you so much for your time. When I close my eyes at night, I can feel the rock being cut open by water. I hear a grandfather's song, and it sounds like sand walking down the river bottom. And in this song, they talk about how even the mighty canyon walls were carved by meandering streams. Beneath the gentle waters, there are people, not people like you and I, stone people. And when I close my eyes at night, I am one of them. And over lifetimes, she courses over me until I am polished and smooth. She teaches me about patience and forgiveness. She teaches me how to be gentle, yet persistent. And in her language of trickles and bubbles, she speaks to. And in her language of trickles and bubbles, she speaks to us. And she says, journeys, take them, but try not to forget who you are along the way. I have nothing for you but these words, so place them in your pocket, and I will see you again when you arrive at the ocean's throne as 1,000,000 kernels of sand. Her voice hums in my blood, quiet as a stream in the night, and it is this song about how we are all just so loved. The eagles dip their talons into her soft body and pull from it a fish, a flesh meal for their children, as they sing this grandfather's song with her. And it sounds like feathers cutting into the sky. And it is a song about how even hatred surrenders to wonder. She's breaking my heart apart like a stubborn granite puzzle of problems. And even the hardest doubts and sorrows give way to her infinite grace. And who knew that sometimes grace comes in the form of a raging river, until it rips away everything you thought you owned, all the blame and all the shame, and replaces it with a love, with a weightlessness, with a grace so profound that you can't not cry. Tears of absolute praise, and run all around the riverbanks, shouting to the cattails and the minnows and the crawdads about the truth of beauty, about the truth of a creator that breathes through the trees, truth of a creator that weaves winter from water and night, truth of a creator that weaves bodies from dust and light, and carries us down the river of life, over and over and over again, until we finally understand the meaning of forever. Forever. In the language of the stones, there is no word for regret, only the complete understanding of what it means to be a beloved son or daughter. We are the rocks, and God.
We are the rocks, and God, she is the water. Well, thank you so much, Lyla June. And congratulations and many well wishes to your sheep and to your land and to your mountains and to the waters and to the rocks that are with you.
Thank you.
Be with all of our listeners.
Yes, thank you so much for taking the time. And as you all probably know, the dissertation is open access online. It's called Architects of Abundance, Indigenous Regenerative Food and Land Management Systems, and the Excavation of Hidden History. And thank you, Sara, for lifting it up. And I lift you up in return. Thank you. All right. Have a great day.
You too.
Thank you so much for listening to the Remembering and Re-Enchanting podcast. If you are enjoying what you are hearing, please subscribe, share, and leave us a review. I am always happy to hear from you, dear listener, to continue finding ways to connect the disconnected and go deeper on your own journey of remembering and re-enchanting with your communities, your organizations, and your families. I invite you to check out our courses and other community offerings via the Sequoia Summit Via website. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Though I must admit I spend much more time working with really amazing people than crafting social media. If you want to work with me one-on-one or bring me to speak at your organization or family office, you can find out more at sarajolena.com.